Late on the night of June 27, 1997, a seasoned Hollywood screenwriter set out from Santa Fe, New Mexico, for the familiar drive home to the California coast. He carried a finished script, a steady reputation, and the calm confidence of a man used to long, solitary drives. Yet somewhere along that well-defined stretch of desert road, he vanished without leaving a trace. A simple overnight journey turned into a silence no one could explain. How does a man disappear on a road that never hides its travelers? In the 1990s, Hollywood moved at a fast and demanding pace. Studios pushed for more productions, tighter schedules, and quick rewrites whenever market trends shifted. Writers often found themselves at the center of this pressure, expected to deliver scripts that were both entertaining and efficient, with very little room for delay. It was a time when late nights, sudden phone calls from producers, and hurried changes to storylines had become normal parts of the job. Against this backdrop, a screenwriter had to be both creative and disciplined in order to stay steady in an environment that rarely slowed down. Gary DeVore had managed to do exactly that. Colleagues remembered him as calm and self-contained, a man who did not raise his voice and did not let panic show on his face. He carried himself in a measured way, with movements that seemed deliberate rather than rushed. When he spoke, his tone was even and controlled, the kind of voice that gave the impression he had thought his words through before saying them. In his work habits, he was equally steady. He treated screenwriting as a craft that required routine and structure, not sudden bursts of inspiration alone. He kept regular hours when he could, wrote daily when he was on a project, and kept his notes organized in a way that made sense only to him, but always allowed him to find what he needed. People close to him knew that when a deadline approached, he became even more focused. He preferred to separate himself from social obligations and outside distractions, making room in his days and nights for the work he had to finish. This tendency to withdraw into a quiet place when he was approaching the end of a script explained in part why he was in Santa Fe in late June 1997. Santa Fe was far from the noise and constant interruptions of Los Angeles. It gave him space to concentrate on a script he had been struggling with, a project titled The Big Steal. For weeks, he had been trying to push through a difficult stretch in the story, and by his own account, he had felt blocked and unsatisfied with the pages he was producing. To him, leaving the familiar environment of home and office was not unusual. It was a method he used to clear his thoughts and work without distraction. Physically, Gary was a man in his mid-50s who appeared younger than his age in posture, but carried the quiet weariness of someone who had spent many years in a demanding industry. He was of average build, with a equal face that showed little drama but could shift quickly into concentration when he spoke about work. His voice was not loud, but it had a steady firmness that made people listen. In daily life, he moved with the calm assurance of someone who was used to taking care of himself, whether in an office, at home, or on the road. Long drives did not intimidate him. In fact, he had a known habit of taking the wheel himself on trips where others might have chosen a plane. He liked the feeling of control behind the wheel and the steady line of headlights on an open highway. Those who knew him said he was a careful but confident driver, comfortable with long distances, including at night. In the days leading up to his disappearance, the mood around his work had finally shifted. After a period of creative frustration, he told his wife and a few friends that he had broken through the problems that had been troubling him. The script, which had refused to come together for so long, was now moving in the direction he wanted. Pages were being completed, scenes were aligning, and he felt that the story had at last found its proper shape. By the afternoon and evening of June 27th, he considered the draft ready enough to bring home. The sense of relief that comes from finishing a difficult piece of work was present in his conversations. From his point of view, The hardest part was over. With the script now on his laptop and his notes in order, Gary made a decision that fit his usual habits. Instead of staying one more night in Santa Fe, he planned to drive back to California immediately. The idea of heading out late and driving through the night did not alarm him. He had done similar trips before. He intended to leave Santa Fe, join the main interstate routes, and follow the familiar path westward toward the coast, eventually reaching his home in Carpinteria, where his wife was waiting. It was, on paper, a straightforward journey, one that many drivers completed every day. Sometime late that evening, he left the office space he had been using in Santa Fe. The exact minute he stepped out is not recorded in any official way, but it was late enough that most of the city around him was already settling into night. He packed his laptop, which contained the new script, gathered his personal items, and began the drive out of town. His planned route would likely have taken him onto the main highways leading west and then south, passing through stretches of desert and linking into the network of roads that eventually connected to Southern California. By habit and by logic, it was a path he knew and had reason to trust. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, his wife, Wendy, made a call to him. This call would later become the last known contact anyone had with him. She would recall that he answered, that his voice sounded somewhat tired after a long day but not alarmed, and that the conversation was brief. He did not clearly say where he was. There was no mention of trouble with the car, no complaint about weather or road conditions, and no sign that he felt unsafe. For reasons that would later trouble investigators, the telephone company did not have a record of this call in its log, even though Wendy was certain it had taken place and could remember details about what was said. The absence of that record would become one of the small but persistent questions surrounding the case. After that short and vague conversation in the early hours of the morning, there were no more contacts. No additional calls came from his phone, and no one else spoke with him or saw him that can be confirmed. From the point of view of anyone watching from the outside, he was simply a man driving through the night on a route he had chosen many times before. Yet somewhere along that road, after that final call faded into silence, his presence vanished from view. And after that moment, no one saw Gary DeVore again. The morning after Gary failed to arrive home, there was still enough uncertainty for his wife, Wendy, to believe he might simply be delayed by fatigue or a decision to rest along the road. But as the hours moved toward midday, and then late afternoon, the silence became harder to explain. Gary was not someone who ignored calls for long periods, and he had never missed an estimated arrival time without at least offering a brief update. When evening approached and still nothing changed, Wendy made the decision to report him missing. Her voice, steady but strained, provided the basic details. Gary had left Santa Fe late the previous night. He intended to drive directly back to Carpinteria, and his last known contact had been a short, unclear call around 1 in the morning. With that report, the case shifted from a personal concern into a matter for law enforcement. The initial reaction from police was measured but serious. Missing person reports involving adults often began with the assumption that the individual might have chosen to alter travel plans or might be temporarily unreachable. But in Gary's situation, officers noted several details that made the case different. He had a defined route, a planned destination, and a history of reliable communication. He was not known to disappear voluntarily, nor was he dealing with personal circumstances that might prompt him to abandon his routine. Most importantly, his drive required crossing long, sparsely populated stretches of desert, where delays caused by mechanical failure or medical distress could quickly become dangerous. For these reasons, officers opened the investigation without delay and began determining which sections of the highway system required the first review. Because Gary's route crossed multiple states, the early coordination between jurisdictions became a crucial step. Santa Fe police forwarded the case to New Mexico State Police for highway-related checks. From there, Arizona authorities were contacted, followed by California Highway Patrol, as it became clear that his estimated travel hours would likely place him somewhere within or near their borders by daylight. Each state handled its own segment of the route, and the challenge lay in stitching these segments into a unified picture. The absence of a specific last known location made the process slower. Unlike cases where a vehicle was last sighted at a gas station or toll booth, there was no clear anchor point from which to begin. The investigative methods in the first 72 hours focused on objective signs of movement. Officers checked highway cameras positioned at major junctions and exits, hoping to capture at least one image of his Ford Explorer. None showed a match. Patrol units reviewed accident reports from the night and early morning hours, but no crash resembling Gary's vehicle had been recorded. Next, investigators contacted gas stations along the logical driving path, requesting information on overnight customers. Large stations with full staff had no recollection of him, and smaller stations with limited overnight personnel had no transactions that matched his credit cards. Lists of hotel and motel check-ins were reviewed in case he had decided to rest briefly, but none contained his name or an unidentified guest matching his description. Financial activity was another avenue. Officers checked his credit card accounts for fuel purchases, lodging payments, or incidental expenses that might indicate a change in his plan. Not a single transaction had been made between his departure from Santa Fe and the time he was reported missing. For a man driving across 3 states in the middle of the night, the absence of a fuel purchase was significant. It suggested either that his vehicle had not progressed far, or that he had encountered difficulty before reaching a major fueling point. Yet, if that were the case, investigators expected to find evidence: a stalled vehicle on the shoulder, marks on the road, or a call for assistance. No such evidence appeared. The next step involved checking the records from cell towers along the probable route. Although cellular coverage in 1997 was not as extensive as it would later become, there were still enough operational towers along the main highways to trace basic movement. Investigators hoped to find a pattern, a signal that connected with towers in sequence, showing his vehicle advancing west. Instead, the data provided almost nothing. Aside from the call Wendy described, one that did not appear in the phone company's official logs, there was no recorded tower connection that could be confidently attributed to Gary's phone. Without those markers, the investigators were left with an open landscape and thousands of possible miles in which something might have happened. As the search continued, the story reached local newspapers, beginning in New Mexico and later spreading to California. Hollywood publications picked it up soon after, not because the industry expected scandal, but because Gary was well-liked and quietly respected. Journalists hoped for a quick explanation, perhaps a breakdown in a remote stretch of road or an unnoticed medical emergency. Yet, as days passed, no simple answer emerged. Volunteers called in with tips, but none matched the facts. Drivers who had traveled overnight along the same highways were interviewed. A few believed they saw a similar vehicle, while others recalled nothing out of the ordinary. None of these accounts aligned well enough with the timeline to be useful. Gradually, the inconsistencies began to deepen. There was no image of his vehicle on any camera along the probable route. There were no eyewitness accounts that could be verified. There was no record of him stopping for fuel, checking into a motel, or asking for assistance. The road, which usually offered at least a small trace of a traveler's progress, showed nothing at all. For investigators, this absence made the case difficult in a way that had nothing to do with complexity. The challenge was not a trail that was confusing. It was a trail that seemed never to have existed. By the end of the initial investigation, authorities reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The disappearance had no clear starting point, no confirmed last location, and no physical evidence to anchor a theory. It was not that the clues were contradictory, it was that the clues simply were not there. And with that realization, the search entered a stage in which every step forward became more uncertain than the last. In the weeks following the initial investigation, the momentum that had carried the search forward began to slow. The first days had been filled with coordinated checks, calls between jurisdictions, and repeated attempts to trace even the smallest piece of evidence along the route from Santa Fe to California. But as July passed into August, investigators found themselves returning to the same points without progress. Reports were reviewed again, highway patrols were questioned once more, and lists of possible sightings were compared against previous interviews. None of it shifted the understanding of what had happened. The absence of a starting point had become the defining obstacle. Without knowing where the trail ended, it was impossible to know where it began. Gradually, the case transitioned from an active search into a state that investigators quietly referred to as waiting for new information. Though among themselves, many recognized that it was moving toward a cold status. For Gary's wife, Wendy, the shift was not something marked by a single announcement, but something felt slowly through daily routines. Each evening carried the same structured hope that perhaps a new message would appear on the answering machine, or that someone would call with a detail that had been overlooked. She kept the lights on at the house during the hours Gary would normally arrive from a road trip, a small gesture that had once been a welcome home habit, but now became a quiet signal of waiting. Friends from the film industry checked on her regularly. Many brought theories, not out of certainty, but because silence was difficult to accept. Some believed Gary might have pulled off the highway to rest and suffered a medical emergency in a remote area. Others suggested mechanical failure, imagining the vehicle stranded beyond the reach of passing traffic. A few proposed more unexpected explanations, though none had evidence substantial enough to share with police. Messages began to appear, some anonymous, some delivered through calls, others through letters. Most were vague claims from individuals who believed they had seen someone resembling Gary in rest stops, diners, or small towns along the interstate. These sightings, while hopeful at first, rarely survived scrutiny. They lacked detail, or the time frames did not align, or they referred to individuals who, when approached, were found to be unrelated. Among the anonymous messages were a few that hinted at knowing more than they stated, but when investigators attempted to verify them, the origins could not be traced. The calls came from payphones with no clear location. The letters arrived without return addresses, and none provided information that pointed to a new direction. As the months continued, the investigative workload gradually declined. Departments that had devoted officers to the case had to reassign them to new incidents with more immediate evidence. Reports were filed away, though they were never closed, and the case remained technically active, even if the day-to-day efforts had become infrequent. The central difficulty remained unchanged. There was no point of last certainty. Without a physical marker, no one could map the path of his vehicle with confidence. A journey that appeared simple on the surface had now become a blank space, stretching across 3 states. When detectives reviewed the maps used during the early weeks of the search, they often remarked that the absence of a final confirmed location made the case feel as though the missing driver had stepped off the road and into an undefined gap. The year was marked by occasional flickers of hope that appeared and disappeared with equal speed. One person claimed to have seen a man matching Gary's description in a bus station in Arizona. The timeline, however, placed Gary in 2 places at once, if the account were to be believed. Another caller suggested he had overheard a conversation in a bar about a stranded SUV along a service road. Yet when officers were sent to search the area, nothing was found. These leads, while not implausible, created more questions than answers. Investigators recorded them because they were obligated to, but the lack of supporting evidence prevented them from reopening larger searches. A small twist came months later when two separate drivers, interviewed weeks apart, mentioned having seen a dark SUV traveling against traffic for a short distance during the night of Gary's disappearance. Both accounts lacked clarity. The drivers were unsure about the exact time, could not provide a license plate, and differed in their description of the SUV's speed. One believed it was weaving slightly. The other thought it was moving steadily but did not understand why it was on the wrong side of the road. Investigators considered the possibility, noting the detail as unusual, yet without confirmation, it remained only speculation. It did not help narrow the search, but it added a small layer of complexity to an already difficult case. As the one-year mark approached, the collective sense of hope that had fueled the early search began to thin. It was not replaced by resignation, but by a quieter, more cautious patience. Wendy continued to hold on to the belief that something would eventually surface, though she no longer expected sudden news. Friends still called, though less frequently, and conversations shifted from expectations of immediate answers to reflections on how unclear the situation remained. Investigators reviewed the file one last time before the end of the year and confirmed what the evidence already suggested. The case, as it stood, lacked direction. No new sightings had been verified, no physical evidence had emerged, and no one had come forward with information strong enough to reignite a full-scale search. The absence of progress created a form of stillness around the case. Days turned into months, and eventually into a full year, without anything tangible to anchor the investigation. And in that lengthening stretch of time, every hope that once felt urgent grew softer, not out of loss, but out of the quiet understanding that without new evidence, the road ahead would remain obscured. The case had not ended, but it had settled into a silence that no one could easily break. In the middle of 1998, nearly one full year after Gary's disappearance, the case shifted unexpectedly from quiet uncertainty to sudden activity. The change did not come from a new lead, a confession, or a witness stepping forward. Instead, it came from routine maintenance work along the California Aqueduct near Palmdale, a long stretch of waterway that cut through the open landscape and served as one of the major channels transporting water across the state. The workers assigned to the area were accustomed to finding debris carried by wind or runoff. But on one ordinary day, a maintenance employee noticed something that did not resemble the usual scraps. A piece of metal was protruding slightly from the water's surface, glinting in the sun in a way that caught his attention. At first, he believed it might be a fragment of discarded equipment or part of a barrier panel. But when he moved closer, the shape suggested something more substantial, possibly part of a vehicle. The worker reported the finding, and local authorities arrived to assess the situation. When divers entered the water and began their inspection, they soon confirmed what the surface clues suggested. Resting at the bottom of the aqueduct was a dark-colored vehicle. After clearing enough debris to inspect the make and model, the identification became unmistakable. It was a Ford Explorer. The license plate matched the one registered to Gary DeVore. After a year of silence, the vehicle long searched for had finally been located, not on a roadside or in a ravine, but at the bottom of a controlled waterway that had been inspected during the initial search efforts. The effort to retrieve the vehicle required careful coordination. The aqueduct's banks were steep, and the flow of water strong enough to make the operation deliberate rather than quick. Heavy equipment was brought in, along with a team trained in water recoveries. As the vehicle was lifted from the depths, mud and debris slid from its exterior, revealing the body of the SUV for the first time since it had vanished. Observers noted immediately that the headlights were switched off. The airbag had not deployed, suggesting either a low-impact entry into the water or an unusual angle of descent. One of the windows was shattered in a way that did not align neatly with typical collision patterns, raising questions among those watching the extraction. When the doors were opened and the interior examined, more irregularities appeared. The laptop Gary was known to have carried, the one containing the completed script, was not inside. Neither was the firearm he routinely traveled with for personal safety. The absence of these items was noted with care, as both had been present when he left Santa Fe. Even more unsettling was the condition of the recovered remains. The body was incomplete, with the hands missing entirely. Divers later found small bone fragments nearby, but the pieces were insufficient to conclusively identify, and the cause of their separation could not be immediately explained. Environmental factors, scavenging animals, and water movement were considered, but no single explanation satisfied all questions. As investigators reviewed the scene, a significant twist emerged from the records of the original search effort. The aqueduct, including the exact stretch where the vehicle was found, had been inspected shortly after Gary was reported missing. At that time, no vehicle had been detected. The certainty of this earlier inspection led to quiet but undeniable concern among investigators. If the vehicle had not been present during the initial search, when had it arrived? And how had it entered the water without anyone noticing, given the surrounding roads and visibility of the area? This discovery reshaped the internal discussions. Officers revisited the maps detailing the search grids from the previous year, confirming that the section of the aqueduct where the SUV was found had indeed been checked by both visual scan and limited sonar. Those involved in the first search insisted that an SUV of that size would not have gone unnoticed. The possibility that the vehicle had entered the water at a later date began to surface, although no one could suggest how such an act might have been carried out without drawing attention. The position of the vehicle also raised further questions. The angle of the interior damage and the placement of debris indicated that the SUV may not have entered the aqueduct from the most direct route. The nearest roadway from which a vehicle could have plunged into the water did not align perfectly with the resting position. For a moment, investigators considered the idea of a slow slide or drift caused by water flow, but the mechanics of the aqueduct's currents did not support such movement over the necessary distance. The possibility, however remote, that the vehicle had been placed intentionally, rather than through accidental descent, was quietly acknowledged. Yet without physical evidence of tampering, no formal conclusion could be drawn. When the SUV was transported to a secure facility for closer examination, the oddities multiplied rather than resolved. The lack of identifiable tire marks or damage on the fences near the aqueduct indicated that the vehicle had not simply crashed through a barrier. The absence of belongings inside suggested that someone, or something, had removed specific items either before or after the vehicle entered the water. The missing hands added another layer of uncertainty, as their absence made it difficult to determine exactly how long the remains had been there, or whether any form of restraint or injury had occurred prior to the entry into the water. In the days following the recovery, reporters gathered outside the investigation offices, hoping the discovery would finally explain what had happened to the missing screenwriter. But instead of answers, the discovery produced only new questions. The finding of the vehicle confirmed that Gary's journey had ended in the aqueduct, yet almost every detail surrounding that conclusion seemed inconsistent with the expected patterns of an accidental crash. The headlights being off, the airbag not deploying, the missing items, and the strange window damage were all pieces of a puzzle that did not fit neatly together. By the time investigators completed their initial evaluation of the recovered vehicle, the conclusion was clear. The discovery had not solved the case. It had only shifted the mystery into a different form. The year-long absence now had a location, but not a cause. And instead of reducing the number of uncertainties, the recovery of the SUV had multiplied them, leaving the case more tangled than before. Somewhere within the details lay the truth, but it remained just out of reach, waiting for a clearer understanding that had yet to arrive. When investigators finally had the recovered vehicle and the incomplete remains in front of them, the case, instead of drawing closer to resolution, began moving into a new phase marked by cautious interpretation. The task now was not simply to state what had happened, but to determine which explanation could withstand the details presented. Although the official reports leaned toward a single conclusion, those working privately around the edges of the case understood that a disappearance with this many gaps would inevitably invite several possible readings. And as the physical evidence was examined more closely, 3 broad lines of thought began to take shape, each carried forward not by assumption, but by attempts to reconcile the inconsistencies found at the scene. The first line of analysis was also the simplest, that Gary had suffered a lapse in alertness while driving through the night and had veered off course. Fatigue was a well-known risk on long drives, especially after days of intense mental focus. If he had grown drowsy, the possibility of drifting into the wrong lane could not be dismissed. From there, a small misjudgment might have carried his vehicle toward the aqueduct. Yet, as officers retraced the surrounding roads, a complication emerged. For the vehicle to have reached the specific point where it was found, Gary would have needed to travel approximately 4 to 5 kilometers against the normal flow of traffic. Such a movement was difficult to align with the habits of a careful driver, particularly one familiar with the route. Even more difficult was the lack of witnesses. The stretch in question was not deserted. Truck drivers and late-night travelers used it with regularity, and it seemed unlikely that a vehicle moving in the opposite direction would go unnoticed along such a distance. This did not fully eliminate the possibility of an accident, but it prevented the theory from settling comfortably. As discussions continued, a second idea appeared quietly among those who observed the case from a different angle. It arose not from dramatic suggestions, but from the modest observation that certain missing objects, the laptop containing the script and the firearm Gary routinely carried, created an unusual gap in the narrative. The laptop, in particular, had been the one item he kept closest during his work. Its absence was striking, not because it pointed directly to wrongdoing, but because it removed the very thing he had traveled to Santa Fe to complete. The script itself, the big steal, was said by some of his colleagues to touch upon sensitive material, though opinions differed as to how sensitive it truly was. Still, the fact remained. The machine on which it was saved was gone. And layered upon that absence was the detail of the missing hands. It was a fact that could be explained in several ways, including natural processes in the water, but it also carried the unintended effect of making fingerprint analysis impossible. None of these observations, taken individually, were enough to anchor a conclusion. Yet together they formed a pattern that some felt could not be ignored. If the laptop and the gun had been removed, someone might have interacted with the vehicle before or shortly after it entered the water. At the edges of these discussions, a third line of thought emerged, one not officially endorsed, but acknowledged in quiet conversations. It centered on the timing of the vehicle's appearance in the aqueduct. Search records from the previous year did not leave much room for doubt. The section where the SUV was discovered had been examined shortly after Gary was reported missing, and no vehicle had been found. The aqueduct was not the kind of place where a Ford Explorer could hide easily. It was a controlled environment with clear sight lines, monitored by staff familiar with its structure. For the SUV to be present a year later suggested either an error in the initial inspection or the possibility that the vehicle had entered the water at a later date. If it had been introduced into the aqueduct after the main search had ended, the question naturally followed: how and by whom? No clear answer was proposed, and officers avoided declaring such possibilities formally. Still, the detail lingered, carried quietly by those who noted that the position of the vehicle did not line up cleanly with the most direct descent points from the road above. As these considerations circulated, the official position began to take shape. Reports emphasized the likelihood of an accident, citing the late-night travel, the possibility of fatigue, and the absence of evidence proving deliberate harm. And in the procedural language of administrative conclusions, an accidental entry into the water was recorded as the most fitting explanation. Yet beneath the calm surface of these written statements, the inconsistencies remained. Officers who had participated in the initial search still remembered their certainty that the aqueduct had been clear at the time. Analysts reviewing the missing items still noted the oddness of the empty spaces where the laptop and firearm should have been. Specialists examining the injuries and missing hands acknowledged that the findings were compatible with environmental effects, but not exclusively explained by them. In the end, the official determination did not resolve these tensions. It simply provided a framework in which the case could be closed from a procedural standpoint. For those directly involved, the conclusion offered administrative clarity, but not narrative certainty. It was a verdict that settled the file, but left the story unsettled. And because so many details resisted easy classification, the final result created an unusual balance. The case was formally ruled an accident, yet the data surrounding the event did not align fully with that designation. In this space between conclusion and contradiction, the mystery deepened rather than faded, ensuring that the questions raised by the discovery would continue to circulate long after the paperwork was complete. When the examination of the vehicle and the incomplete remains concluded, authorities faced a difficult reality. There was not enough evidence to treat the case as a criminal act. The findings, while unusual and filled with contradictions, did not meet the legal standards required to open a homicide investigation. Without signs of assault on the bones that could be recovered, without an identifiable last location, and without a timeline that pointed clearly toward human involvement, the file remained suspended in a space where suspicion existed, but proof did not. This placed the investigation in a position familiar to law enforcement, but deeply unsatisfying to those connected to the missing man. Technically open, but without momentum. Technically solved, but without answers. For the family, especially Wendy, the ruling did not bring closure. She made formal requests to reopen the investigation, arguing that the condition of the vehicle and the missing items justified a deeper review. Her appeals referenced the laptop that carried the only complete copy of Gary's final script, the firearm that had been with him when he left Santa Fe, and the absence of both hands, which made forensic confirmation incomplete. But each request met the same response. The case lacked sufficient grounds to meet the criteria for reopening. Without new evidence, the procedural framework of the justice system could not shift. What Wendy perceived as gaps worthy of examination were, to the reviewing offices, inconsistencies that did not rise to the threshold of criminal suspicion. From a legal perspective, the limitations were clear. The most fundamental obstacle lay in the absence of direct witnesses. No one had seen Gary's vehicle enter the water. No one had interacted with him in the final hours verified beyond the ambiguous phone call with his wife. Even the drivers who later recalled seeing a similar SUV traveling the wrong way could neither specify the time nor confirm essential identifying details. Without a confirmed last sighting, the chain of evidence had no anchor, and this alone weakened the case substantially. Furthermore, the time of death could not be determined with precision. The condition of the remains, influenced by water temperature, depth, and the passage of a full year, made any attempt to establish an exact time frame impossible. Without a defined window, legal interpretation drifted back toward the most neutral explanation: accident rather than crime. Examiners also noted that the bones retrieved did not show marks typically associated with assault, restraint, or violent struggle. While the absence of hands raised questions, the remaining skeletal material did not provide the physical indicators that courts rely on to classify a death as suspicious. In legal terms, the difference between unexplained and criminal is substantial, and this case rested firmly in the former category. For investigators trained to work within clear boundaries, these details formed an uncomfortable but familiar picture: a death with anomalies, but without evidence to elevate those anomalies into a case of wrongdoing. Outside official channels, however, some independent investigators and retired officers revisited the case informally. Their assessments did not possess legal authority, but they contributed to a broader understanding of why the disappearance continued to trouble observers. Several pointed to what they called structural bottlenecks in the investigation. One was the complex handoff of information between multiple states. Each jurisdiction managed its own section of the search and its own documentation, but the integration of those records was not seamless. The transition from New Mexico to Arizona and from Arizona to California created natural gaps in communication, especially in the early days when the urgency of the case had not yet matched the scale of the territory involved. Another bottleneck lay in the technical analysis of the recovery site. Reports on the depth of the aqueduct, the speed of the water flow at the time of Gary's disappearance, and the debris patterns inside the channel were detailed but not exhaustive. Some specialists believed that further hydrodynamic modeling might have revealed whether the vehicle could have drifted from another entry point. Others argued that the initial search of the aqueduct, conducted under time pressure, might not have reached the precision needed to rule out the presence of the vehicle with absolute certainty. These reflections did not contradict the official findings, but they added layers to the narrative, highlighting the kinds of uncertainties that often accompany investigative efforts spanning large distances and long timelines. A small but noteworthy twist emerged when a water flow expert was asked informally to review the details surrounding the missing hands. His analysis suggested that under the right environmental conditions, hands can detach from a submerged body due to the combination of decomposition and moving water. This explanation aligned with general forensic principles, but it did not address the disappearance of the laptop and the firearm, objects that would not be affected by biological processes or water movement. The expert's view resolved one question while leaving others untouched, creating a balance that neither supported nor undermined the official conclusion. Instead, it underlined how the case contained elements that could be explained individually, but not as a coherent whole. In the end, the official determination remained unchanged. The death was ruled accidental, the file was not reopened, and no criminal perpetrator was identified. Yet, despite that conclusion, the narrative surrounding Gary's disappearance never settled fully. The combination of missing items, inconsistent search results, and unexplained details prevented the story from closing cleanly. For the authorities, the case was complete in the administrative sense. For those who looked more closely, it remained suspended between explanations, resting in a space where nothing pointed definitively toward crime, but nothing aligned comfortably with chance. Thus, as the final pages of the official record were set aside, the truth of what happened on that night remained unresolved. The file was closed, but the story was not solved. And with the passage of time, the distance between the procedural answer and the human desire for understanding only grew wider, leaving the disappearance of Gary DeVore in a place where certainty could not reach. In the months following the official closure of the case, life for those connected to Gary shifted into a quiet pattern, defined not by new developments, but by the continued presence of unanswered questions. Without fresh evidence, the investigation moved into a background position, a file that existed in the system, but no longer demanded daily attention. Yet for Wendy, Gary's friends, and the colleagues who had worked with him, the case did not dissolve into the same stillness. It remained active in a different way, through memory, speculation, and the quiet hope that time might reveal what the investigation could not. For Wendy, the adjustment was the most immediate and the most difficult. She returned to her daily routines, but they no longer carried the familiar rhythm they once had. Each evening, she continued the habit of leaving the porch light on, a gesture that had been part of their home for years. Initially, she did it out of instinct, then out of hope, and eventually out of something quieter, an acknowledgement that certain routines hold meaning even when they no longer serve their original purpose. Friends visited often in the early months, bringing meals, conversation, and attempts at comfort. As time passed, the visits grew less frequent, not because people cared less, but because life naturally shifted around them. Yet Wendy maintained the same steady waiting, not with expectation, but with a sense of honoring the space Gary once occupied. In the wider circle of the film community, the case became a point of somber reflection. Writers and producers spoke about Gary with respect, recalling his professionalism and the calm way he approached his work. Some kept small reminders of him in their offices, notes he had written on earlier scripts, emails he had sent offering advice, or drafts they had once exchanged during collaborative projects. In conversations, his disappearance was never turned into rumor or spectacle. Instead, it was discussed as a rare moment in their industry when a life known for its stability simply slipped out of view without explanation. Over time, the story blended into a broader understanding that even familiar roads can hold uncertainty, and even steady routines can end abruptly. Documentary filmmakers and journalists revisited the story on several occasions. Some hoped to uncover a new angle, others wanted to explore the human side of the mystery, and a few focused on the procedural challenges of investigating a disappearance that spanned several states. Each attempt added something to the public record: an interview, a detail from an acquaintance, or a new question raised by someone who had worked in law enforcement at the time. But none of these efforts produced the missing piece required to transform speculation into clarity. Instead, they reinforced the sense that the case belonged to a category of events defined not by what is known, but by what remains concealed. For investigators who had worked on the case, the years that followed carried their own reflections. Some retired, others moved to different departments, and a few continued to follow the case quietly, even without official capacity. In interviews much later, several admitted that the absence of resolution was unsettling in a professional sense. A case without a conclusion challenges the structure of investigative work, which relies on cause and effect, evidence and interpretation. With Gary's disappearance, every attempt to construct a complete timeline left spaces that could not be filled. It taught them, in a narrow but enduring way, that sometimes the limits of available evidence can define a story more than the facts themselves. Amid this landscape of uncertainty, moments of hope appeared occasionally in the form of new tips, though they rarely carried weight. A caller might claim to have seen someone resembling Gary in a distant town. A letter might arrive from someone who believed they knew something about the case. Yet each lead, when examined, faded quickly. The years made verification more difficult. Memories blurred, locations changed. The possibility of uncovering new physical evidence diminished with time. But these brief sparks, however faint, reminded those closest to the case that unanswered stories do not fade entirely. They resurface, even if only for a moment, as reminders that people still care, still wonder, and still hope. The emotional center of the case, however, remained with Wendy. She continued to keep a box of Gary's personal items, a few handwritten notes from the Santa Fe trip, a pair of reading glasses he used while working, and a small notebook he carried on drives, filled with ideas for scenes and fragments of dialogue. One page, written with the kind of hurried clarity a writer uses when capturing a thought mid-flow, contained the last dated entry before he began his final drive. The words were simple, unrelated to his disappearance, yet they carried a weight that lingered. It was a note about character motivation, something he planned to refine when he returned home. She kept that page separate from the others, folded carefully, as a reminder that his journey had not been meant to end where it did. From the perspective of the community, the legacy of the case became less about the speculation and more about the quiet human reality it represented. It illustrated how easily a straightforward journey can turn uncertain, how a life rooted in routine can be interrupted without warning, and how the absence of answers can weigh just as heavily as the presence of tragedy. The disappearance of Gary DeVore did not reshuffle legal precedents or change investigative protocols, but it left a lasting impression on those who followed the story closely. It stood as a reminder that even in an era of growing technology and expanding information, mysteries can still remain beyond reach. As years passed, the story settled into a place where the procedural record ended, but the emotional record continued. Some believed that new forensic methods might one day offer insight. Others hoped that a forgotten detail in an old report might surface. And a few, quietly and without expectation, held on to the sense that time has a way of revealing what it once concealed. Yet as it stands, the disappearance of Gary DeVore remains an unanswered chapter, suspended between possibility and silence. If this case leaves you with questions, share what you think may have happened during Gary DeVore's final drive. And tell us, where did you first hear about this disappearance? Your comments and support help bring depth and clarity to stories that time has yet to fully